Brunswick, a town of over 20,000, a town of peace and quiet, a town with an impressive history of war heroes, patriots, and scholars, a town proud of its heritage and of those who lived in it before, but a town that is unaware of the pain and of the suffering that took place in it many years ago. Brunswick lies on the shores of the Androscoggin River, under the shadow of Fort Andros, once known as the Cabot Mill. Though few people in Brunswick realize it, this landmark was the site of the torment of a people who came to this nation in the hope of prosperity and freedom, but received only hatred and oppression. Within the walls of the mill toiled a people that was, for generations, invisible. In the years following the Civil War, Brunswick was a town on the rise. The home of renowned war hero Joshua Chamberlain, recently elected governor of Maine, it was a crossroads for many who ventured north into the heart of the state. It was home to Bowdoin College, where Chamberlain had once taught, and was a popular site for tourism, one of Brunswick's chief imports. The other was textiles. In an age of factories, the textile industry was booming in towns all over New England. Brunswick was no different. A mill had been built on the shores of the Androscoggin River, renovated from the old fort built to defend against Indian attacks. It was owned by the Cabot Lowell family, which controlled a vast empire of factories throughout Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. For most Americans, working in a factory represented a dead-end job, a job which could barely provide for one, let alone a family. For others, it was different. In Quebec, the legend of American prosperity reached the ears of the struggling farmers in the north. In droves, they streamed into New England, taking up the trade and flooding the factories with enthusiastic, cheap labor. Ruth Klein is a resident of Brunswick and a descendant of French-Canadian workers who worked in the mill. Over the years, she has compiled information pertaining to their history.
And the reason they came here is because agents from the mill needed more manpower, and there wasn't enough in Brunswick originally. Many of the Irish worked the mills. And now they needed a labor force 3 times the amount that was available, so they sent agents up to Quebec in the poor farming districts and recruited people to come to the mill.
For some, it was a dream come true. For the Americans already living in New England, it was something else. The history of racism in America is the history of job competition. In this case, it was the French-speaking Catholics taking jobs away from the English-speaking Protestants. One writer in the Bath Times, a widely read newspaper in Brunswick, referred to the incursion of French-Canadian workers as the Papist invasion. Nowhere was this more apparent than in Brunswick. The Cabot Mill featured a cluster of tenements for the workers, right on the mill's property. There, the French-Canadians lived, separate from the upper-class Anglo society. This seemed to suit the Anglos well. They had no need to fraternize with the French, who they regarded as a temporary labor force, which would return to Canada once enough money was made. Accordingly, the Cabot Company considered the tenements to be part-time housing. When it became obvious that the French were there to stay, they did nothing to change it.
My mother's family, all of them worked in the mills growing up, and they had 13 children, but 7 only lived to adulthood, 7 of them. And all 7 of those children worked in the mills all of their lives, except for when, like my mother and my aunts, when they got pregnant and started raising a family, some of them quit the mill, some went back after their kids were older. It was hard work. It was noisy, very noisy, lots of lint. The noise was the biggest, lots of lint. So it was a health problem for a lot of people. The hours were very long and the pay was very low. And there was a lot of job accidents. There were a lot of hazardous things. And especially when they hired young people, there were a lot of kids working in the mills at a very young age.
The tenements were a disgrace, a blight on the face of Brunswick. Bad to look at and worse to live in, there was no efficient water supply, no heating, no room, and, with every trained physician in Brunswick being Anglo-Saxon, no doctor. Among Brunswick's most famous citizens at the time was Alice Whittier, the first female pediatrician in the state of Maine. Her house is preserved and houses the Pejebscot Historical Society, Brunswick's own history museum. A testament to the anonymity of the French Canadians is that in the entire exhibit, no mention of them can be found. The poor conditions in the tenements gave little protection against disease. Scarlet fever, influenza, and above all diphtheria ravaged the population. In one summer, over 100 French died of a diphtheria epidemic, most of them children. Numerous petitions were submitted to the Cabots begging for aid, but they were all ignored. The French were on their own. Invisibility was their greatest problem. Even though by 1882 they made up over half the population of Brunswick, with 6,000 French altogether, they were largely ignored by the rest of society. That year, Brunswick celebrated its 150th anniversary. To commemorate the town, a book was published by George and Henry Wheeler recording Brunswick's history. The Francos were never mentioned.
And this was, even in 1900, there's a famous Franco author, and he describes that despite the fact that in 1900, 50% of the population was French-Canadian, and yet they were ignored by the Anglos. In 1880, maybe 25%, but also we were all clustered initially around the mill.
Doris Sandon is a resident of the Heights and grew up there as a child. Much of her family worked in the Cabot Mill at the turn of the century.
But coming across an article of how the French were treated, some children, both English and French, I think fell off a boat or a pier or wherever into the water and drowned. And in the newspaper article they named the English people, but just said 2 Frenchmen drowned. And didn't even record who they were or their ages, or whenever there was a fire or a drowning or anything that happened, the French were just overlooked. They just neglected to record it. Wow. So you never knew the name of the person or their age or where their parents were or where they were from or anything. And that was the way they were treated.
In the midst of this crisis, 2 men would take it upon themselves to rescue the Francos from their fate. Dr. Ansume Paré, a young Franco doctor, and A.G. Tenney, the editor of the Brunswick Telegraph. Paré grew up in Brunswick and got a degree from the University of Michigan. However, rather pursue a normal career as a doctor, he returned to Brunswick to help the desperate workers. Quickly, Paré realized that the only way to save the Francos was to draw attention to their situation. He took his story to Tenney, who was already concerned over the conditions in the mill.
He was trying to put pressure on the Cabot Mill and the town officials to put pressure on the Cabot Mill to improve the situation at the mill. The tenements were overcrowded, sanitation was non-existent, the wells were contaminated, the environment looked like a slum. It was very unhealthy. And Dr. Party, which was a French-Canadian doctor, and the head of the Telegraph, Brunswick Telegraph, wanted to put pressure, but nothing was happening.
Together, they began to publish stories that spread awareness of what was happening, recording the deaths and ages of the deceased. It was not a popular decision. Brunswick's wealth was the result of tourism, and no one wanted to go to a town riddled with diphtheria. An editorial in the Bath Times condemned Tenney, saying that he was killing the town for no good reason. Meanwhile, Paré fought day and night to combat the disease. He would work almost non-stop for 6 months. Inevitably, he fell ill himself. With no other doctor in the tenements, he died. On the day of his funeral, the Cabot Mill, for the first and only time in its history, gave its workers a day off. Tenney and the Telegraph proclaimed Paré to be a hero. His death would provide them with the story to finally catch the attention of the state government. A commission was formed to inspect the tenements, which were eventually deemed unsuitable for the workers. The Cabots were instructed to find them new accommodations. A group of landowners took it upon themselves to create a new community for the Francos. They chose a stretch of land across the river known as the Heights. The turn of the century found the Francos in considerably better condition. They had a well-organized community and a more permanent residence. However, this brought further animosity.
But as time progressed, the reaction changed drastically in Brunswick. In the 1920s, all throughout Maine actually, the Anglos began to realize that this population is not here temporarily, it's here to stay. They were now buying land, they were now establishing roots here, and This was a threat to many people.
In the early 1900s, Maine had the second highest number of members of the Ku Klux Klan. With the growing Catholic population in Maine, the Klan's tactics became more violent and occurred more often. In 1925, a march of over 10,000 Klansmen took place in the city of Portland. It was the largest gathering of Klansmen to occur in a state that had supported the Union. Fortunately, Brunswick saw little violence.
And in Brunswick we were lucky because although there was discrimination, they really didn't do a lot of damage personally to the people like they did in other communities. They didn't burn down houses, they didn't burn down churches. There was graffiti, there was rocks thrown in the tenement windows by kids just for the fun of it, and things like that.
But as time progressed, discrimination became more rare, and eventually Francos were accepted into society more openly. Today, Brunswick is a patchwork of both Anglo and Franco cultures, and the divide no longer exists. The community is no longer fragmented the way it once was. But regrettably, the story of the Francos is not well known. Time alone will tell if it ever will be.